I was wondering if you could speak to negotiation strategies. So I had an interested buyer, and I got him together with the seller on a Zoom, and he'd of course seen the financials and seemed really excited. And we set up an email thread with a Google Sheets document where both buyer and seller could explore different deal structures. And then, after about 3 weeks, all of a sudden, the buyer just dropped out and said, I think I need a business that's more of an absentee type business. And he just vanished.
Yeah. Well, for starters, I don't let the buyer and seller negotiate directly with each other, typically. So, and that's just my process. So there's many ways you can do things, but in general, the buy-sell meetings are in my opinion, and what I tell all my buyers and sellers is that buy-sell meetings are to talk about the operations of the business, not deal structure. So deal structure is going to be between me and the buyer. Okay. I'm going to talk to the buyer. I already have knowledge typically about what a seller is looking for. And so if I know for sure seller does not want to carry a note under any circumstances, and buyer starts talking about, okay, I need the seller to carry a 50% note, then I'm going to tell them right off the bat, well, we can make that offer, but I can tell you right now, the seller's not going to go for it because, if you will reduce that, maybe you want the seller to carry 10, 20%, we might have a possibility of getting the seller to agree to that. But seller has made it very clear he doesn't want to carry a note. So there are certain things that you can do, when you are talking with a buyer individually and help them structure. It's like, well, what do you need, Mr. Buyer or Miss Buyer? Are you looking for more working capital? Maybe I can find you a lender that will get you additional working capital. Are you looking to mitigate your risks? Well, what else can we do to mitigate the risks? And so you try and find out what their objectives are and figure out, hey, look, the one of the biggest skill sets you have to have as a business broker is creative problem solving. Right? Because there's always going to be tons of obstacles. You're always trying to figure out how to go over them, under them, around them. So you just don't want to try and go through them because that's where you get a headache, right? Beating your head against that brick wall. So when you can have that direct conversation with a buyer, seller's not present, then you come up with a structure, with an offer that you think might be, maybe it's not everything the seller wanted, but at least it's something you can sell. You can present it with confidence. You can say, hey, look at Mr. Seller, I know you didn't want to carry a note. Buyer is wanting to mitigate risks. They want to make sure that you're going to be around, that you're going to stick around and do the training and handle, answer the phone when they call with questions or whatever. So they're asking you to carry a 10% note, which is, more than reasonable. Lender's probably going to want that anyways, so you can have different conversations at that point with seller. My process is, I'll try and get the buyer to present an offer that I think is going to be pretty palatable to the seller first time around. Then I'll deal with the seller. And if the seller, if there's anything that's, 100% objectionable, then I go through a process of trying to find out from the seller, okay, well, what can we do that will make it palatable for you? How can we restructure it? Now I already know what the buyer needs at this point. I'm not telling the seller that. I'm just, I could throw out some other ideas for the seller, but ultimately I'm trying to come up with a structure that I know will be pretty close and acceptable to both. So it's only when you get down to where, most everything is okay, but you have one or two minor issues, that's when I get them both at the table and say, okay, look, you're here, we've got all this in agreement, we've got these two little things that are differences. How can we resolve these two minor issues so that you guys can both achieve your goal, you seller of selling your business and you buyer of buying the business and having a new career? And but if you just let them start the negotiations from the beginning and try and work out the deal structure between the two of them, seller wants what seller wants, buyer wants what buyer wants, and you have to come up with something that's going to be a win-win for both sides, or you're not going to have a transaction. Okay, so you need to stay involved in that process and see what you can come up with in terms of creative problem solving to make sure that buyer gets what buyer needs and seller gets what seller needs. And sometimes the question is, hey, Mr. Buyer, what are the top 3 critical issues to you? What are the top 3 things you need the most? And then you ask the seller the same thing. What are your top 3 priorities? If you could get these 3, are you willing to give up some other things? And so, then if there's not a direct conflict between the 3 items buyer needs and the 3 items seller wants, if there's no direct conflict, you can almost always structure a deal that's going to work.
Thank you.
Sure.